a tree, where there strung up a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be, if we met at midnight, in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. When I go to any kind of out-of-town event, UFOs, Bigfoot, ghosts, I like to take our travel trailer along, so I'll have a coffee maker right there at the foot of the bed. Lots of beans. The only thing that gets me out of bed in the morning is the smell of fresh coffee just feet away. The neat thing about having an RV is it's more like being at home while away because everything in it is yours. You're not sleeping in somebody else's bed. Who knows what might be right there underneath that mattress cover? Some kind of blood-sucking bug? Maybe something left behind by an unsavory character? Just imagine how clean that room really is. RV is better. I also have a coffee grinder in the cabinet, so the coffee, when I make it, is the freshest and the bestest. It's the best coffee in the universe. I get my beans, which aren't really beans, from Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson here in Laredo, or you can visit organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Coffee makes for good decisions, and the best coffee makes for the best decisions. Karens make the world interesting. The male version of a Karen is a dick. I'm amazed by how many comments I get from folks who say things like, "I hate your show." Try that again. "I hate your show, it sucks." Or, "You're wrong about so many things. Your show sucks." I don't get it. If I find a podcast I don't like, I don't listen to it. No comments needed. Folks just have an overpowering need to open their mouths and shove a foot in there. I just got back from the Jefferson UFO Conference. It was great and weird at the same time. I'm usually sitting in the audience, listening to other people talk, writing what they have to say, taking notes, and trying to sell a few books. This time, I was on stage, but there was no stage, just the front of the room. I told people I know that I hoped I wouldn't be the first or the second, I would be the first or the second speaker, and get it out of the way as soon as possible so I could stop worrying about screwing up. Once you've screwed up, you don't worry about it anymore. If you go first, you don't have a really good job. Most folks forget because they focus on the people coming after you. The guys that look good, sound good, and know what they're talking about. Say I was asked to come on right after Daryl Sims, the alien hunter. The audience would all be saying, "Hey, this guy's nothing like that dude in the big cowboy hat." And he does wear a big cowboy hat. People would compare me to him because Daryl's presentation would still be fresh in their minds. Instead, I was on just before Daryl. No one threw tomatoes at me. In fact, a few people actually said they liked my PowerPoint show. It's nothing like doing a podcast video. A lot of podcasters look and sound really good. They also do a lot of editing. Kind of like how some images of people on Facebook look so good until their filter cuts out. How did Jen Clampett say it? "Hoo doggy, that chick looks like a man." I took lots of notes. As each speaker got up on the the non existent stage, I would scribble down what they had to say. My memory is so good I can remember things that never happened. I took notes and then I have to figure out what the speaker was saying because my handwriting is so bad. I didn't get to listen to all of the speakers. I would move back and forth between my table and the conference room as folks came in and went. I was able to catch all of Mitch Whitington's presentation, but I missed just about all of the next speaker, Jay Mitchell. People coming into the building would walk past my table, and some would stop and check out my books. I sold quite a few, and I did give away a few. Some of y'all will know about my many adventures and misadventures over the years going to conferences all over Texas. In 2022, I had paid for the site visit in Edinburgh, where the UFO attacked and destroyed a company working in a caliche pit. The workers all escaped with their lives, but nothing else. I'd also paid for a table at the festival, and I had tickets to the conference. I'd also reserved a spot at the local RV park. I was set for a fantastic weekend. I was driving along 83 South, just outside of Zapata, when my truck began to run really bad. I wrote this off as to maybe being some bad gas or maybe a spark plug wire had come loose. Our trailer only weighs 3,000 pounds and the ridgeline is rated to 5,000. I pulled into a gas station to look under the hood, but I couldn't find any plug wires that weren't doing their jobs. I gassed up and I flipped a mental coin. I could continue on to Edinburgh and hopefully make it, and then be stuck there waiting to get my trucks fixed, or I could try limping on back home. I really wanted to go. I really wanted to see the crash site and sell a few books. I wanted things I knew that I couldn't or shouldn't have. It was all I could do to turn for home. As I was driving, the engine got worse. I could barely pull away from a signal light. I spent a lot of time driving on the shoulder so that the folks behind me could continue on their way. I dropped the trailer off at home and headed to Tony's garage. Tony Aldape keeps my vehicles on the road. It turned out 2 of the 6 cylinders were out of action. TJ said they would rebuild the engine and it should be on the road in a couple of weeks. I sent a message to Daniel telling him I was not going to be at any of the events. I'll bet a few of y'all remember the great times we all had right after the Black Plague of 2020. That was one long 3-week period of time that we were locked down. I remember that they told us just take the edge off of the outbreak. We're all going to stay home for 3 weeks. Apparently, the folks in Washington either can't count or they can't use a calendar. Those 3 weeks turned into about 14 months. TJ called me and said they were having trouble getting any of the parts they needed for my truck. It wasn't just my truck. Nobody was able to order anything because some bonehead had decided everything should be made in some other country, some country on the other side of the planet. The same country that has some really crappy laboratories. My Ridgeline is made in Alabama. Ridgeline trucks sold in the U.S. come from the Honda of Alabama plant in Lincoln, Alabama. In addition, most parts that go into American Ridgelines are sourced locally. That includes transmissions and engines. For unknown reasons, the folks who supply the mechanic shops all over the U.S. told everybody they could not get parts because of those people over there. The 2-week job wound up taking 3 months. TJ finally had to order a rebuilt engine, and they dropped that in. My truck ran like it had a new motor. Well, it did. I tell people I'm slowly getting a new truck, a new engine, new front end, new tires all the way around, and new brakes. Rack and pinion was replaced, as well as the power steering, and now maybe the transmission. After the conference, I woke up at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I thought I could unhook my camper from the RV site, drive home, which is only 540 miles, and surprise my wife by getting home early. The best laid plans. I hooked up the trailer. I did the required walk around to be sure all was well. I looked under the hood and I checked all the fluids, and I began that long drive. I had Vic Hermanson on my tablet. He was talking to David Griffith and Father Mike about Elizabeth, the vampire. It would appear that Annabelle Lee had been out of town investigating dangerous things. She's working for Vic, but he hasn't figured out how to pay her since she lives a few something or other time units in the future. The show was great. I listen to the podcast in reverse order because the platform that I use, if you play them in the right order, they stop after each show and then you have to hit play again. In reverse order, they just keep playing. I don't know why. Maybe it's my tablet. Next up on my playlist was the conversation between Vic and Elizabeth. He was writing to her and she was responding. You need to listen to this show as well. It's based on a book about a real live vampire that I can't remember the name of the book or who wrote it. I was going to contact Vic and I forgot because I have a lot of other things on my mind, like my pickup and my camper and all my books and a few other things. Once I had exhausted Trailer Trash Terrors, I clicked on Josh Turner and Paranormal Roundtable. I catch up on all the latest things from them. It feels weird to pull into a closed gas station and still be able to gas up. The pumps stay accessible all night long. If I need the bathroom, well, I have one right there in the camper. I pulled into a tiny town called Thrall, and I filled up. Back on the road, and all was looking good. When there came a loud grinding sound from under my truck, which was followed by a huge bang, and then a clattering sound. I was heading down a slight hill, and I quickly threw the shifter into neutral. I steered off the highway onto a gravel road, and I stopped. I popped the hood and I looked at the engine, but it was running fine, and so I got down and I looked up underneath. I didn't see anything there that could have been broken, but when I put it in gear, all it did was make that grinding noise. As I stood there in the dark, I thought, maybe I should call Josh Turner. He lives in Austin. I'm not going to do that. I don't throw myself on my friends. It was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I don't think Josh would have appreciated a phone call at that hour. Of course, knowing him, maybe he was still up. I don't do that to people I know. Well, friends. After looking around for somebody to blame, I called Geico, and I told them I was going to have to use my roadside assistance thingy. The wrecker was coming from Taylor, so I just sat there drinking coffee and waiting. Later, I called my wife and let her know how much fun I was having, and I told her that my plans had changed slightly, but that I was going to get myself out of this mess somehow. I had a plan. The wrecker came and he put my truck on the bed, and then he hooked my camper to the rear boom. I asked the driver to take me to the closest transmission shop, and he said, no comprende English. Speak Spanish? I can speak Spanish, some, when I'm relaxed and I'm in a good mood and I don't have to say or ask anything out of the ordinary. I can order food and I can ask for directions. I can use all the bad words because I used to hear them at work all the time. Eventually, I got my message across and we headed to town. We got to a transmission shop, but it was closed. Everything was closed because it's early Sunday morning. I had to leave my truck with a note on who I was and what I needed done and all my phone numbers and the keys, and then we left. The plan was we would drop the trailer at their yard. I had called a U-Haul to rent a truck so I could recover my camper, at least get it back home, with all my things that I had taken out of the truck and now piled on the floor. The guy at the U-Haul said I could pick up a 3/4 ton pickup in a half an hour. I should still be home by 2 or 3 p.m. I put my computer bag with every electronic device from my truck in my travel bag and my camelback on the floor of the wrecker, so I would have my toys if I needed them, and nobody would walk off with them if they were unattended. The camper had to be left in the wrecker yard. Things began to go downhill just a bit. The driveway into the yard was steep, and as he was pulling in, the landing gear, that thing that you crank the trailer tongue up and down with, it hooked on the pavement. The driver took the camper into the yard and then took it into a second yard where it was locked up twice. They have a huge fence all the way around the lot. The second fence also is huge. No dogs, though. I was surprised. To unhook the ball hitch, we had to drag a truck tire rim over and set the tongue down on it, and then loosen the hitch on the truck. I am now in the process of trying to get them to replace the landing gear, but I'm not holding my breath. Otherwise, it's going to be fun trying to get hooked back up. I asked the driver to take me to the U-Haul place where I could pick up the truck that I was renting. It would be the nice thing to do since he had damaged my camper. I was going to get with his company and see what I could do later. U-Haul sent me a nice little map on a link telling me exactly where I needed to be to pick up the pickup. Not too redundant there. I looked at it and things got even more interesting. The rental was in Tyler, Texas. I was in Taylor, Texas, 190 miles away. At some point, as we were trying to communicate, if that was the right word, the driver began to get a bit antsy. This little job was getting too long and he had other customers to wait on. I asked him to drop me off at the U-Haul in town, but he had no idea where it was. And it wasn't really his job to drive me around. He suggested I should get someone else to do it. Who, I don't know. I tried looking for Uber and Lyft, and I couldn't find either one. Now, I try not to be a dick, but sometimes life just does it to you. I was in a bad mood due to my truck being broken. I was in a strange town where I knew nobody, and I was out of coffee. After we had some things back and forth, I told him to just drop me off right there at that restaurant, and I pointed to a restaurant. I paid the bill, I got out, and he drove away. About this time, I realized I didn't really know where I was. I knew I was in Taylor, Texas, but I didn't have the location, and I didn't have any way of getting from there back home. I did call the U-Haul and I told them they had given me the wrong city and could they put me in contact with the local U-Haul office within a few miles. It was Sunday morning. All the local shops were closed. They would all be open Monday morning. Thinking about it, I realized I wouldn't be able to hook up the camper with the damaged landing gear anyway. If I had my truck, I could use that great big hydraulic jack I keep in the toolbox for emergencies, but I wasn't. I asked if the company also rented high lift jacks, but the guy said no, just vehicles. I canceled the rental and then I called my wife again. I explained the new situation and I asked if she would be interested in making the 268-mile trip to pick me up. My wife doesn't like to drive on the highway and she doesn't like to drive out of town. If I'm with her, she might drive my truck for a few miles, but long highway trips are not her thing. It makes her extremely nervous. She said she would be there as soon as she could, but she was going to call her sister to do the driving. Our family does things like that for each other all the time. I told her I would be at the HEB that I could see in the distance across the parking lot. I would send her the address as soon as I had an address. I had to walk a few blocks carrying all my stuff. Not too far, but the sun was now high in the sky and it was beginning to get hot. Once I got to the HEB, what's that you're thinking? What's an HEB? Only the best grocery store in the world. They have decent prices and a huge selection. They have their own line of food, which has none of the nasty stuff that you find in a lot of other people's products. Just look for the little green check mark and you'll know that none of the poison they're trying to put into our bodies is in the product. Why did I choose to wait at a grocery store, you may ask? The folks working at every HEB I've ever visited are always very nice. Plus, they usually have a deli where you can get coffee and sandwiches. I grabbed a cart. I put my bags in it. Now I look like some kind of a homeless guy pushing a shopping cart around full of all my possessions. It was hot and I was sweaty and I had grease in some bizarre locations on my body and my clothes. I asked one of the workers where their coffee bar was and he said they didn't have one. He also said that people had kept asking him where it was. I told him how many HEBs did serve coffee, but once again, the best laid plans. I needed coffee, so I walked out the parking lot. At the far end of the shopping center, I spotted a sign that said, "A Fuga Coffee Shop." I pushed the shopping cart along the parking lot, looking more like some homeless guy than ever. Once there, I ordered a huge Americano and I asked, what was an afuga? It's Hebrew for chill, the man said. I wandered around the parking lot drinking coffee and seeing the sights. As the day dragged by and it got hotter, I decided to go back inside the HEB to cool off. I told any workers that looked at me that I was not some homeless guy, that I was just waiting for my wife to come pick me up. Everybody told me to just enjoy myself if I could, stay cool, and not to worry about it. The only drawback was there were no chairs to sit in, so I had to stand leaning against the shopping cart. I parked next to the main entrance or exit, depending on which direction you're facing, and I waited. I had my book to read, some coffee left, and a lot of time to kill. I had 4 hours. My wife and sister-in-law had left Laredo at 1 p.m., and so I waited. People coming into the store would give me a mixed look. I did swing through the store and buy a sandwich and a drink. At long last, there was my wife and my sister-in-law Rosario, and it was at 5 o'clock. It had been 12 hours since I broke my truck. I offered to buy them lunch or dinner since they were nice enough to come and get me, and I had absolutely no appetite. I just drank tea and pondered life, the universe, and, well, Monday morning, I called the manager of the store and I told her that the staff were all nice to me and that nobody tried to chase me out the door or call the cops. She was surprised. I had taken the time to pass on my thanks for all the people working there at an HEB superstore in Hutto, Texas, which is right next door to Taylor. I also called the transmission shop and I told them who I was and what I hoped they could do for my truck. The owner said he would get right on it and call me with his assessment. I then called the record company and I asked about the damaged landing gear. I'm still waiting for them to get back to me on that. The long and the short of this story is when you get up in the morning, you don't know really what kind of a day you're going to have or where you might be spending that day. The best laid plans. My notebook is still in Taylor, in the camper, along with all of my books, food, and clothing. Not having my notes, I'm using what passes for my memory to tell you all about the conference. Finally, Mitch Whitington was the first speaker, and his subject stuck in my mind, probably because he talked about the Cape Girardeau UFO crash. Back in 1941, 6 years before Roswell and 7 before the Laredo incident, Reverend William Huffman had been a resident minister at the Red Star Baptist Church in Missouri. The Reverend had been moved into the area because the church was a bit short on cash and Huffman was a very gifted fundraiser. He could talk people into making donations like nobody's business. During the discussion after the presentation, it came up that seeing as Huffman was there to raise money for the church, he would have to have been registered at the county courthouse, since he was involved in money changing hands. This may have been why the Reverend was the one called for the sheriff's department. It was coming up on Easter Sunday when the phone rang late at night. The Reverend answered the phone and was asked to accompany a deputy to what appeared to be an airplane crash. He was asked to go along to render aid if possible and give the last rites if needed. Back before World War II, there wasn't anything like an ambulance, what we're all familiar with today. This is kind of sad since way back in the 15th century, they did have ambulances. The first record of ambulances being used for emergency purposes related to the troops of Isabella I of Castile in 1487. The Spanish army of the time was well treated and it attracted volunteers from across the continent. And among their many benefits was they had a military hospital. The car was dispatched to pick up Reverend Huffman, and he told his family he would be home when he got home. The car was not a sheriff's unit, but a plain black sedan. The driver was not in uniform. It was 1941, and folks didn't think anything was weird about things like this. The driver took Huffman about 15 miles to the crash site. Once out on the ground, at first Huffman didn't understand what he was looking at. Once on the ground, at first Huffman was looking for an airplane, but instead what he saw was a big disc. No wings, no tail section, just a big round craft. What he saw in the dark, illuminated by flashing red lights and a few small handheld lights, did not look like an airplane. A quick glance inside revealed what looked like hieroglyphics on the walls. He was there for the injured, and so the Reverend went to where the bodies were. He thought he was about to speak to an injured child. The body was too small to be anything else. It was only 4 feet tall. He was looking at a small being with huge eyes, hardly any mouth at all, no ears, and it was completely hairless. Huffman tried speaking to this creature, and he said all the things that you say when you don't know if a person is going to live or not. The creature never responded to any of the words. Eventually, Huffman went to the other 2 bodies, and he found them to look exactly the same. He did pray for the souls of each of the victims, not knowing if they had one or not. As he was wandering about doing what he could, Huffman saw others, some in uniform, others volunteers like him, all trying to make sense of what they were looking at. There was a news reporter wandering around taking photographs and interviewing anyone who might answer questions. He saw the 3 dead aliens and he asked a couple of men, that is, the reporter did, asked a couple of men if they would hold it up so he could get a decent photograph. They did, and he did. These men had been there to help out. They were just a couple of volunteers that showed up because they might be needed. When there was an emergency, everybody would come running to help. Today, too many people will say, what's in it for me? Folks will grab their cell phones and they'll make recordings, while the decent thing to do would be to roll up their sleeves and help out. Chris Jordan from Curious Realms was at Jefferson. He interviewed me as well as all the other speakers. We all headed over to Joseph's Riverport Barbecue to consume great food. The discussion got around to music, and Chris said that Prince would stop singing and he would stand there acting as if he was recording the audience with a cell phone. He would then say, "Annoying, isn't it?" Yes, it is. There is a time and a place for making recordings. Let the folks in the screen decide when it's okay. Oh, by the way, Prince never had a cell phone. He never bought one. He never owned one. The people working the crash site heard trucks coming. Lots of trucks. The military had arrived. As soon as they were out of the trucks, they began ordering the deputies, the firefighters, and the volunteers to leave the crash site. As they were moving away from the debris, the soldiers were confiscating any items that might have been part of the craft. The newsman's camera was taken, as well as his notes. Everyone there was told to raise their right hand and to swear to keep this entire incident a secret. It was a different world back then. Civilians thought the government was there to protect them. And if the government told you to hand over something or they told you to keep your mouth shut, people did. The US wasn't at war in 1941. Most people were banking on the war in Europe to grinding to a halt soon, and they never thought that the US would wind up right in the middle of that whole mess. The bodies, the crash wreckage, all went into the back of the trucks, which drove away. Nobody, not even the sheriff, was told what the flying disc was, where it came from, or where it went. Huffman finally got back home sometime around midnight. His family was there to welcome him home and ask how bad was the crash and was anyone killed. Huffman said he was going to tell them what he saw just this one time, and that was it. He said he was never going to talk about what he had seen, and they were to never ask him. He described the weird-looking disc that had crashed. It looked as if it had split in two. As he was walking past it, he could see inside. There were markings on the walls that to him looked like hieroglyphics. It was on several of the inside walls, but there was nothing on the outside. He described the bodies he had gotten a very good look at. You don't stand there or kneel over someone praying and not remember what they looked like. They were about 3 feet tall. I'm sorry, earlier I said 4. No, no, I don't remember. They were either 3 or 4 feet tall. They were very short. They had huge heads and spindly arms and legs. All of these creatures were wearing full body suits made of some kind of a silvery material, like tinfoil, only it didn't make sound when you crumpled it. It was near impossible to tear. There didn't seem to be any openings or stitching. The faces were bizarre. The eyes were huge and they went around the sides of the heads. There were no eyebrows, no nose, and the mouth was tiny and the chin was nearly non-existent. He told about the army showing up and herding everyone away. And once finished, he never spoke about that night again. Leonard Stringfield wrote a book called UFO Crash Retrievals, The Inner Sanctum. He told about a military-controlled UFO crash retrieval that became that because the people with the answers refused to tell us is still being looked into today. Leonard Stringfield was born in 1920. He became a UFO investigator and researcher, writing many books and lecturing all over the country. After looking into the Laredo incident in 1948, Stringfield was giving a public talk in Dayton, Ohio, right next door to Wright-Patterson, when he began receiving death threats over the phone. The state police had to escort him back to his hotel room where he had to stay for some time. I don't know if it was days or maybe a week, but he was under protection for a while because of what he knew. Stringfield was the director of civil research, interplanetary flying objects, which was called CREFO, and he published a monthly newsletter called Orbit. 1957, he became public relations advisor for the civilian UFO group National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, NICAP, under the direction of Donald Keyhole, who was a close friend of his. During the 1970s, he wrote a number of books about recovering alien spacecraft and alien bodies. He died of cancer in 1994. Huffman died in 1959. His wife, Floy, said after that first night, William never talked about that crash or what he'd seen there. A few weeks after the crash, Huffman was apparently given a photograph of 2 men holding up a dead alien. In late 1983, Floy Huffman was diagnosed with cancer. Her granddaughter invited her to come stay in Tyler, Texas, while she was recovering from treatments. A Charlotte man tried to keep her grandmother comfortable right up until the end. In the last days of her life, Floy began to tell Charlotte all about the things that William had told her that night. The naysayers all jump on this time gap. From 1941 until 1983, nothing was said or written about the crash. They say this is too long for when it happened until it got written down, so therefore none of it could possibly be true. In his last days, my dad couldn't remember anything. He was confused about where he was and who I was on occasion. But ask him about working on the farm back when he was a young'un and his time living in Houston working at the Maxwell House coffee warehouse. He could tell you every minor detail. He was their quality control expert. He would weigh bags to be sure that they had the right amount of coffee, and each night he would grab a random bag of coffee, make a pot of coffee, and drink it to make sure that it was good to the last drop. That phrase, good to the last drop, was invented by Teddy Roosevelt during a visit to Andrew Jackson's estate called the Hermitage. The president finished his coffee and he asked for a second cup, after which he said, "This is good to the last drop." Maxwell House immediately began using the phrase in their advertising. I almost forgot the point I was trying to make. People's minds are bizarre, to say the least. I can remember in minute detail things that happened years ago. Usually these were life-changing events. Things like when my brother threw a dart and I caught it in the back of my hand. It didn't hurt until he pulled it out. Yes, we were boys. We threw darts at each other. I'm not going to talk about the knife fight. Memories can be messed up. Huge memories tend to stay glued in the mind. There are things I wish I could forget, but they're with me till the end. If you don't have any of these memories, what have you been doing with yourself? Older folks can remember things from years ago, while at the same time they forget to put on their pants before walking out the door. Charlotte was told the story over the span of several days, and although Charlotte had heard bits and pieces of this story before, she now wanted all the details. One detail that her grandmother told was of the newsman running around taking pictures the night of the crash. He had 2 cameras. Gerald D. Frauenbarger was taking photographs for the newspaper that he worked for. When he asked those 2 men to hold the alien up so he could get a couple of good shots, he used the news service camera and then he pulled out his personal camera and he took 1 photo. Days after the Army had sworn everyone to secrecy, Frauenbarger visited Huffman. He said he recognized the reverend from church, and he figured that Huffman was the kind of man that he needed to speak to. Frauenbarger came to visit late one night, and even though Huffman and Frauenbarger had been sworn to secrecy, this didn't stop them from sharing photographs. Frauenbarger said he had managed to keep his small camera out of sight, and the Army guys didn't go so far as to search people as they were leaving the crash site. Once home, he developed the image and he looked at it, wondering, what would the military do to him if they found out that he had it? Paranoia set in. He began to worry this might lead to some kind of a bad event. The image of the 2 men holding up a dead alien was way too important to allow some government bureaucrat to conceal it from the public. Being a photographer, Frauenbarger made a copy in his darkroom. He wanted it to go to somebody that he could A. trust not to turn it over to the government, B. keep the photographs safe, and C. share the danger of forbidden knowledge. Huffman took the photograph and hid it among his private papers. He never told anybody about it, with the exception of his wife. After William Huffman had died, his son found the photo. He knew exactly what it was the second he picked it up out of the file. An image from the crash site that proved everything his dad had said. Anytime folks were over to his house, he would pull the old photo out and pass it around so the guests could see. There actually was a UFO crash just outside of town. All those stories weren't just rumor. It was real. The story from Roswell began going around for some time. People got to thinking, if the Cape Girardeau crash was real, The Roswell crash was probably real as well. This began the itch, where most people are unable to scratch. A few folks talked about seeing a photo from the crash site. The photo from the crash site was about 9 inches by 9 inches, and it had a white sculpted edge all the way around. For no reason that I can come up with, they used to do this to photos back then. I have quite a few old photos with sculpted edges. Charlotte's dad showed the photo, and people were amazed. One of the guests said he worked at a photo lab and he would be more than happy to take this one and only photograph and make copies of it, maybe even an enlargement or two. Her dad thought this was a great idea. It wasn't. He loaned the one and only photo to this guy and watched it walk out the door and into nowhere. Days later, his dad tried contacting the guy only to never be able to get a hold of him. The man and the photo were gone. I wonder, was this guy sent by the government to retrieve the image? All the talk around town of Huffman's son having a photo from the crash site may have gotten back to those spooks in Washington. There should still be another photo out there somewhere, the original, taken by Franneberger. As of today, nobody has come forward with the original. Somewhere out there, that sounds like a song. Somebody must have that image. Maybe in some old family album or a shoebox. Next time you find a bunch of old photos, take a few minutes to go through them. You never know what secrets you might uncover. Mitch Whitington talked about what he had uncovered while looking into something else. He does research like I do. You go looking for a particular story only to get caught up in another, something you hadn't intended to study. The next thing he knew, he was building a presentation that I must say was captivating. Seeing as all my notes are 268 miles north of me, I had to use a few other researchers' notes to fill in the gaps. If what I'm saying isn't what Mitch said, it's because I don't remember and I had to do some looking elsewhere. There are some people out there that don't necessarily agree with everybody. You can have two people look into the same story and come up with two completely different endings. I doubt Mitch will ever hear this, but if he does, I tried to remember everything the way you said it, but my voices inside my head kept getting in the way. If I made a mistake, let me know. I'll correct it on a later show. Charlotte sat with her dying grandmother and asked all the questions she had come up with over the years, hearing stories of a crashed saucer and alien bodies. There are stories you probably have heard about your family, which long years ago you have no way of substantiating. Unless you start asking the right questions right now, you may never know. My niece and nephew live up in Virginia, and they don't know, or they probably will never know, any of the weird stories from my family's past. Things like how Clyde Barrow, like Bonnie and Clyde. Clyde Barrow shot and killed an uncle in my family. John Napoleon Butcher lived in Hillsboro, Texas back in April 30th, 1932. I am working on a family history, going over all the things that I have heard so that someday when Reagan and Harrison are older, they'll know their family's past. They'll know about some of the weird relatives that they've had. Charlotte Mann was not looking to write a book on the saucer crash. She simply wanted to document the story the way her grandmother told it, so that the story could be right. It was never intended to become public knowledge. Leonard Stringfield was researching the Cape Girardeau crash and he contacted Charlotte. This was when those notes she had taken saved the day. Charlotte was able to give him all the details that would have been vague had she not put everything down on paper. Many folks have now read Stringfield's books. This is what keeps these reports alive. The government can hide the evidence, but they can't control our minds. At least, I don't think they can. Hopefully, maybe. The more I look into things, the more it appears that the government, if not able to control everybody's minds all the time, well, at least they're doing a really good job on some people. Mitch Whitington, being on first, was followed by Jay Mitchell. I was back at my table to answer some questions and maybe sell a couple of books, and so I missed most of his presentation. He was talking about some of the latest UFO reports and how many new witnesses are coming forward to tell us what the government knows but are unwilling to talk about. Daniel Allen Jones was the MC, and he talked about some of the UFO sightings and crashes from the past. Daniel used to run around with Jim Mars looking into the Aurora crash. Daniel went over a bunch of older stories and he videotaped the speakers. He will be releasing them soon, and I'll try to release my small part to my platform. The hard part's getting it from Daniel's computer to my computer. It's a hour show. Well, it's 45 minutes. I ran a bit short. Rita Louise came on talking about some genetic fiddlings from the past. Things like how people might have said, what could happen if we crossed a lion with an eagle? Things like that. Once again, I was back and forth to my table and I missed a lot of her stuff. We had a small break and then it was showtime for me. I sit in front of a camera on my desk and I do my show each week. I speak into a microphone every week. I get a lot more hairy when I look out at a live audience who's all staring up at me and they're all thinking, tell us something good, entertain us, inform us, and don't be stupid about it. I hate speaking into a microphone, especially in public, because you get to hold it just in the right spot in order to make it sound correct. And, well, anyway, I talked about the Laredo incident from 1948, and I also talked about a bunch of UFO sightings that the Laredo Paranormal Research Society have gotten a hold of. Things like a disappearing airplane. Not missing, disappearing. We have accumulated quite a pile of interesting and never before seen videos. They've never been on TV. I don't know about y'all, but I'm getting a little sick and tired of seeing those same 4 military videos as if they're brand new. What is it? The gimbal video and the Tic Tac video and the others. And it's like, don't tell me the government hasn't caught any more videos since those things were recorded. I showed my PowerPoint and I told what I knew, and finally I asked Daniel how the time was going, and it looked like I still had 10 minutes, so I did a quick question and answer session. I was so glad to finally be done and get out of everybody's view. Daryl Sims, the alien hunter, was the last speaker. I was in Edinburgh back in 2021, and I had a table right next to his. As he was about to go on stage, a woman came to my table, looked over my books, and then began to tell me her story. 2.5 hours later, I had missed Daryl's entire presentation. I had missed Nick Pope's entire presentation. To make matters worse, I only had a small notebook, and I was writing as fast as I could as she was speaking. Once I got home, I had to try remembering all of the wild things this woman had told me. Knowing Daryl was about to go on stage, I started walking away from my table when a couple of people came over and they wanted to buy some books. We talked and I sold, I think, maybe 3 books. And finally, I made it in, able to catch only the last half of Daryl's presentation. We took the vendor section down and we headed to dinner, that barbecue place there in Jefferson. The last thing on the schedule was Daryl Sims going over some abduction cases and some things that you might do if you find yourself thinking that you may have just gotten back from a flying saucer trip. Things like call him right away. If you have a black light, run it over your body and see if you can find any alien sweat. Finally, I headed back to the RV park to sleep and get ready for that long drive in the morning. For unknown reasons, I woke up at 1 a.m. and I felt like I should get up and get going. I was wide awake. I felt great. I could be home by 10 o'clock. I put the coffee pot on and I got busy unhooking and hooking up the camper. And you all know the rest of that story. I was able to find a U-Haul here in Laredo that rented trucks, but they didn't have any pickups. A truck was going to cost me $400 to drive to Taylor and back. I had no way of getting from here to there, so I was thinking of going ahead in order to recover my camper. I was able to contact the record company, and they have that policy of not being responsible for anything they do. You've seen the signs at garages and doctors' offices. Not responsible for any mistakes we make that might cost us money. I told them I wasn't going to become a Karen about the landing gear if they would help me hook up the camper. They said yes. I next called the transmission shop and I talked to Mario. He said he had put my truck up on the hoist and he would let me know the bad news in a bit. Later that day, Mario called and he said the CV axle was broken. He was going to replace it and see if that fixed the problem. The CV axle runs from the transmission to the front wheels on a front-wheel drive vehicle. A ridgeline is both front and rear-wheel drive, depending on what you're doing. And somehow the CV axle had broken on the driver's side wheel, and that was why it was making that weird noise. He replaced it, and he said, "Come pick up your truck, it's ready." Now what I needed was some kind person to drive me north so I could get all my things. My wife wanted to, but she's back working at school. My sister-in-law said she would take me, but I would have to wait until Friday. Rosario has a job, but she can finagle her schedule and do what she wants pretty much. Plus, Tony, her husband, is going to go along so that she doesn't have to make that long drive back home alone. By the time this show is out on the platforms, I should have my truck and my camper back home, and hopefully I will never do this again. I said that last time I broke down. Experience gives you knowledge. You get experience by doing dangerous and painful things. If nobody ever said, "Hey, everybody, watch this," there would be a lot less knowledge and fewer experiences to look back on and say, "I probably shouldn't have done that." Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, spread the word. Tell people they need to be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And also tell them if they don't like the show, well, they can keep that particular idea to themselves. If you'd like to help support the show, you can buy one of my books, or even all of my books if you'd like. You can find them at Amazon.com. the Laredo Paranormal Research Society, Fort McIntosh and the Paranormal, Paranormal Laredo, Paranormal Stories, and UFOs, my latest book. Remember, Christmas is coming. It comes every year. Why are so many people surprised? Oh my God, it's December 24th. I need to do my shopping. Be a procrastinator. That's somebody who gets things done ahead of time. Books make wonderful Christmas presents. They don't require batteries. They're easy to wrap. If you drop them, they don't break. And if the person who gets the book doesn't like it, he can always rewrap it and give it to somebody else. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.